Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. The Council's Strategic Foresight Initiative and the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, along with multiple other partners, is hosting this event, and we're very happy to see a huge participation on this, what is actually a very nice morning here in Washington. It's good that it wasn't last week that we were holding this. I'm Matt Burrows, Director of the Strategic Foresight Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And this event, I would talk a few moments, give you some background and context for the meeting. This event is the first in a series of events organized by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, UN Habitat, and partners from around the U.S. to prep the U.S. delegation to this April's World Urban Forum. Now, the series has been done in past years, but it is we're using a slightly different format this time around. At the end of today's meeting, HUD's Ana Maria Argilagos will spend a few minutes talking about the details on that upcoming World Urban Forum and the prep in the series that really the prep series that is being used to help prepare everybody for that forum. My shop, the Strategic Foresight Initiative, works on understanding how long-range global trends will impact the prosperity, security, and development of the U.S. and the global community as a whole. Now, urban issues, urbanization is a very important part of our practice, particularly as you all know, increasingly more and more people are going to be living in urban areas. I think the calculation is that 50% currently of the world's population live in urban areas. Over the next 10, 15, 20 years, it'll be up to 60%. And as we've written about in the Global Trends work and others, up to 70% in the next 20, 30 years. So it's important in terms of understanding, important for us to understand urban patterns and also to begin to think about how urbanization intersects with the other big global trends. As many of you may recall, we held a tech forum meeting here last December when we were looking particularly at smart cities and how technology can actually improve urbanization. And that is a continuing big theme of the Strategic Foresight Initiative. Now, part of this interest in urbanization is also to understand the issue of governance. And one of the big themes in our work actually is the development of urban governments and how that will be very important in terms of solving a lot of the big global challenges. So if you're thinking about climate change or resource issues, food and water, cities are where it's at in most cases. And that is, again, a theme that we are developing in our work. Now, as most of you know, Medellin, Colombia is a city that has transformed itself in the past years. 20 years ago, it was known as the murder capital of the world. However, with innovative policies and bold leadership, the city has staged an incredible turnaround. Not only is Medellin far safer than it was just a few short years ago, people now associate Medellin with many positive attributes, ranging from inclusive governance to high-quality public architecture to sustainable transportation. Now, in large part because of this remarkable turnaround, UN Habitat wanted to showcase Medellin's progress through making the city the host of this April's World Urban Forum. With this background now in mind, I want to introduce the Colombian ambassador to the United States, Luis Carlos Villegas. Ambassador Villegas was appointed to his Washington post in November of last year. He has been a leader in both the public and private sectors, including serving most recently as president of the National Business Association of Colombia, a position he held for more than 17 years. And we are happy to report that Ambassador is also a good friend of the Atlantic Council, and we hope to see him more often, actually, at the Atlantic Council at all of our events. Now, following the ambassador's remarks, we will have two panels focusing on urban innovation in the U.S. and abroad. But first, let me turn the floor over to the ambassador, and he will say a few remarks, and then we'll get going on the panels. Ambassador.
Thank you, Matthew. Good morning, everybody. I think you have taken a big risk inviting an Antioqueño like myself to talk good things about Medellin. That's a mistake. And the mistake increases when you give him or me only 10 minutes. I'll try to contain and refrain myself. Thank you again to the Atlantic Council for this invitation. In my 2 months in Washington, this is my third time in this House, and I really appreciate that. But I want also to congratulate you for hosting with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the United Nations Habitat, the launching of a national series that are leading to the 7th World Urban Forum in Medellin, the next 5th to 11th of April this year. The theme of this gathering will be Urban Equity and Development, Cities for Life. It's not surprising, of course, that Medellin was selected as venue for this major forum. Medellin is an international example of how urban design can boost social cohesion and equitable development. Medellin has prioritized, as Matthew mentioned, vulnerable communities with solutions for accessible mobility, inclusive governance, and quality education, together with the recovery of public space and green areas throughout the city. Undoubtedly, the transformation of Medellin is the example of the transformation of the whole country, what we call the new Colombia, that in the last decade has gone through important changes in the economic, political, and social spheres. Also a country that is emblematic in urban innovations across Latin America in cities like Medellin, but also Cali and Bogotá. Let me give you some figures of that change. Colombia's in 2000 was the 7th economy in Latin America by size. We started 2014 being number 3. Brazil, Mexico, and number 3 is currently Colombia. We used to have, by 2000, by the beginning of the century, 63% of our population under the line of poverty. That figure has gone down to 30% in December. And the trend is dramatically fast going down. We will be in around 15% by the end of this decade. That is lower than the average in Latin America. Gini indicator has improved. We come from 0.6 to cities like Bucaramanga that are now in 0.4. Other smaller cities that are around 0.4. That's the biggest change in Gini indicators in Latin America. I gave a figure to Peter also a few minutes ago. We used to have in Colombia 6 million air passengers in 2006. Last year we closed with 28 million air passengers. The rich cannot fly that many times. It shows that you have a new middle class that has reached an income level that allows them to have a pet, to have a house, and to fly. And that's the new Colombia that is over there. That transformation, I'm always very proud to say, has been built by Colombians. The transformation of Medellin has been built by Antioqueños. But you in the United States have to feel very proud of your timely and generous support and help for more than a decade. The success of Colombia is the success of the US. The success of Medellin is the success of Plan Colombia. The success of Cali is the success of the US Congress. So please share intimately, individually and collectively, the great change and success of my country. We also have in Medellin a successful model of innovative social urban planning with an award-winning public transportation system, a growing entrepreneurial ecosystem, and an increasingly attractive environment for foreign investment. This has been accomplished through several projects designed to lessen inequality and foster social development. Let me mention some of them. The Educational Institute José Asunción Silva, that is housed in a acclaimed architectural premises on areas that once were the sanctuary of illicit activities, gangs, and violence. Or the library León de Grave, that is also a park, is an award-winning. Parque Biblioteca España, that are in the middle of forgotten communities a decade ago. Places where people can study, participate in recreational activities, connect with the world by using on-site computers, broadband connectivity, and a network of libraries that have been recognized, for instance, by the Gates Foundation for its use of technology for community development. Other example, Parque del Río, that was designed to use public areas in the Rio Medellin, the Medellin River, and public libraries that are in the neighborhoods. That's what we call in Medellin the Metropolitan Green Belt. Metrocable, or telepheric or cable car system designed to provide public transportation and connectivity for those living in the poorest areas of the city. And the example of the escalators. The escalators were put in place to replace 350 cement stairs along a steep pathway that inhabitants of the area used to reach their homes. The escalators reduced their travel time from more than 2.5 hours to just a few minutes. The city has now become, in that area, a cultural and environmental model that considers its inhabitants' priorities. There are examples like Explora, the Orchideorama for orchids, or the Wooden Box. The Wooden Box is a very modern, state-of-the-art convention center for innovation, participation of private enterprises, young people that have their startups, and so on. So Medellin has been awarded lately with a lot of recognitions and awards. The Innovative City of the Year by the City Urban Institute that is present here and the Wall Street Journal. Forbes magazine in last week's article was presented Medellin as a unique example of partnership between public and private sectors and economic opportunities for marginalized neighbors. So finally, we are very proud to have the World Urban Forum in Medellin. I think it's the right place to do the forum, to have the discussion, because Medellin has become a great place to live and to visit. Thank you very much. Now, we move to our next panel, that is Public and Private Partnerships for Equitable 21st Century Cities. So, Jason, please. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Jason Marzak. I'm the Deputy Director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council. And I have the very difficult role right now of following the ambassador, who gave such an excellent presentation of the many transformations, not only in Colombia, but in Medellin specifically. And here we're here all together to learn about the different transformations globally, and especially in Latin America. And I think that the transformations in Medellin and in Colombia overall are really symbolic of what can be accomplished when the public sector and private sector work together to look at kind of the whole spectrum of what needs to happen, everywhere from urban spaces to transportation to partnerships that facilitate economic development. So Ambassador, thank you very much for your excellent comments, and congratulations again to the excellent work that Colombia is doing. It couldn't be a better space than to hold the World Urban Forum in Medellin. I'd also like, before introducing our panelists, I'd also like to thank Matt Burrows for his welcome, and also thank our partners, especially U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, not only Anne Marie, who's on our panel, but also Larry Handerhan, who's been working with us tirelessly through this, and to thank Peter and Gelke here at the Scowcroft Center, and Abby Moore at the Latin America Center for all their work in putting this together. We're going to get to introducing the panelists for a second, but just briefly, I'd also like to welcome our panelists, Pam Flaherty from City Foundation, Alonzo Fulgham from CH2M Hill, and Anna Marie Argilagos from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Before going to the panel, I just wanted to frame this of why is the Latin America Center here? Well, I think that the ambassador's comments made it pretty clear why the Latin America Center is partnering on this effort. We began operations in October of last year, potentially specifically to highlight the many positive transformations that you're seeing across Latin America, and to share those transformations with a larger global crowd. And I think that the issue of urban innovation in cities is one of those areas in particular where you see many incredible transformations happening in Latin America that can be applied and learned more contextually globally. In Latin America, in 1950, 40% of the region's population was living in cities. By 1990, that was up to 70%, and today it's at 80%, making Latin America the most urbanized region in the entire world. And this merits special attention of how cities can harness that innovation in cities to foster economic growth, to provide for good governance, to provide for long-term housing, public space solutions, efficient urban services. These are all areas where we at the Arsht Center are seeking to be a thought leader on Latin America's role in this global urban trend, and examining some of the lessons learned in the region's urbanization story, and connecting that Latin America experience to the rest of the world. So as I said, our first panel today is focusing on public-private partnerships for equitable 21st century cities. Pam Flaherty is the president and chief CEO of City Foundation. Pam actually wears two hats, president and CEO of the City Foundation, and she is also director of corporate citizenship and sustainability at City. Came down from New York, braved the weather, and flying down from New York to come here. So thank you. Train. Train is always the way to go, right?
Oh yeah.
And Pam wears both these hats, and she has led City's efforts and both the foundation front, but also on the business front, and specifically on sustainability and environment, and getting City increasingly engaged as a corporate citizen. Alonzo Fulgham to her left is the Vice President for Strategy and Sustainable International Development at CH2M Hill. Besides his role at CH2M Hill, I think we all probably also know Alonzo as being a previous acting administrator of USAID. 2009, you were appointed at USAID, and so Alonzo has very great experience both in the private sector and the public sector on public-private partnerships. And to Alonzo's left is Anna Marie Argilagos, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Office for International and Philanthropic Innovation at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, somewhat of a long title. And Anna Marie, her office.
A lot to do.
You leave a lot to do. Her office is specifically charged with engaging partners in the international and in the philanthropic spaces. So she brings a wealth of experience. Before we get in the panel, I also want to remind you we're live tweeting this event, so it's hashtag ACUrban, and you can also follow the conversation on Twitter, and you can see your comments being posted on the screen there. But let's start off looking more at a macro level at public-private partnerships. We have such a wealth of experience here. And I'd like to first ask Pam to look at this range of public-private partnerships. And city itself is part of a variety of different partnerships. If you could explain a little bit about this range. We think about public-private partnerships, and there might not always be an understanding of what that all means. So if you could explain a little bit of that range. And we're going to conduct this panel Davos style, so it'll be much more of a conversation. So Pam?
I think when we talk about public-private partnerships, what we need to recognize is there's an explosion of innovation, testing, ideas, learning, very, very different kinds of partnerships. And I sometimes think that the title, public-private partnerships, is more narrow than actually what's happening, because you have private business, you have private philanthropy, you have civic engagement of people in communities and cities. You have very different kinds of partnerships that are emerging, and they're tackling very different kinds of issues. Clearly, there's a whole set of things I think we will hear about them in a minute around financing infrastructure, and I'll talk about that a little later at some point. But there are lots of other interesting examples of how these partnerships can develop. One, for example, is innovating by experimenting. It's very hard for public governments to allocate money on something that fails. But what you can do is access sources of funds, philanthropy is one source, that can fund innovation, which can then be proven to either work or not work, and then the public sector can bring it to scale. And I think there's some very interesting examples there. I think addressing systemic issues. I won't dwell too much on examples here, but I think one of the most interesting ones to me was when New York City decided to offer $100 million worth of infrastructure development if universities who were doing applied science and engineering would actually come to New York City because there was a surplus of jobs and a deficit of people. I think that's not necessarily how people think about public-private partnerships. Building platforms for civic engagement. I think one of the things that we talk about in terms of healthy cities is involving citizens in both making decisions and being able to take advantage of opportunities. And there's some really interesting, I think, public-private partnerships in this area. I think there are organizations, for example, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, that's doing some very interesting things to cause collaboration among mayors of different cities in the U.S. and also various external partners. So they recently announced a program to apply to do LED lighting in cities across the United States, which, much to my astonishment, is 1% of all the electricity in the United States. There are 35 million streetlights in the United States. Wow. So from the macro to the micro, I think this area of public-private partnerships is exploding and really producing some dramatic and improved conditions for the inhabitants of cities.
And Anne-Marie, following up on Pam's comments here, some of that range of public-private partnerships from HUD's perspective, there are other ways in which and reasons for engaging in PPPs. Can you explain a little bit about that?
There's a lot to say about that. First, I want to affirm what Pam is saying. It's not just public-private. It's not just an arrow going two ways. It's not even triangulating. It's like arrows going all different ways. I think about it as the 4 Ps, is what we were talking about on Friday, public-private philanthropic partnerships. But there's really many more. There's overlooked sectors, and we have to think about it. I think one mistake that's often done, which is why I added that innovation word at the back of our office. It's about the ideas, it's about the innovation. Governments, and it's not just in the US, but I think really governments, as I talk to counterparts all over the world, we've been working in a particular way for many, many years. And how we get ourselves thinking outside of the box, it's really hard to do it if the table is set, so it's the same traditional sorts of people. If we bring different people, especially from foundations, which have the same interests, right? Mostly foundations want places to be better outcomes for kids, for families, for communities. You get better thinking. So our thought is to set the table a little bit differently, to harness the ideas, as Pam was saying, we are not risk takers by nature. And so we need to identify those innovations, really have that policy transfer in a way that's safe so that we can incubate and implement. So it's not just about the money, it's really the ideas and are just as powerful.
I think that's an excellent point, because I think sometimes folks who might not be working in PPPs think about the private sector's role as a financing role, right? And look at the private sector as you know, that's our source of funding, but it's really the innovation that comes from working with with stakeholders that you wouldn't otherwise be normally working with.
We don't even look for money. We don't ask for any dollars. Our issue is how can we align so that we can leverage so that the sweet spot of our interests, so that you're getting what you need done, and the federal government is also going forward. So it's not about the money at all, although that's nice when it aligns and it is able to leverage, but it's really about exploding the ideas so that they're more powerful.
Alonso, can you like to ask you to join the conversation here and speak specifically? You have those dual roles of both your private sector role and your public sector.
There's a couple of things here. One is, and I'm in violent agreement with everything both of you said, actually, and I use that comment a lot because this is an area that we all are very much interested in. But I love the comment that Matt made earlier about the number of people who are moving to cities and the complexities of the problems moving forward. I've been working with CH2M Health for 3 years now, and after 23 years with government, this urbanization issue is the premier issue that we're dealing with in cities. And I think it's all about local governance. How do you work with the local governors? The partnerships can only work if you have a relationship at the local level. We're back to, as Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. And what we try to do from a public-private partnership perspective is identify areas where there's need, where we have a partner that's actually willing and interested in implementing an activity, especially in the water area. Because I think that is the issue around the world. How do we manage water in an effective way? But we also have to figure out how we are doing it in a cost-effective way, but also efficient way that allows the municipality to manage this in an effective way. So we look at it from a resiliency perspective. Find the activity, find the municipality, and work in an effective way. So the way forward from our perspective, when we look at the world, you've got the fastest growing economies in the world right now in Africa. And we identify a lot of the urbanization issues there. How do you build smart cities? And we want to start at the local level. We want to start identifying projects and activities where we can provide technical assistance as well as management of the capacity within those cities.
Alonso, just to follow up, you make an excellent point about looking for local governments that are good partners. How do you identify those local governments?
Well, one of the things that I think the private sector is having a problem with is understanding the kind of work that it takes in order to build a partnership. It's not a turnkey process. Mm-hmm. You have to put labor, you have to put time in, and you have to work side by side and building those partnerships. And I think that comes from having time on the ground, working in the municipalities, working with effective mayors, and really understanding the needs and find out what you can bring to the project along with the government and also the local private sector. I think we've done a lousy job of really including the private sector within the countries that we're working in. In essence, make them a part of the solution. Mm-hmm. And I think you look at these economies that are growing at 6, 7, 8, 9% per annum. They are making a lot of money. They have a responsibility, just like the donors and the philanthropic organizations, to add a contribution to the long-term development and sustainability of their country.
Yeah. Pam, turning back to you, I'd like to look maybe a little bit at why, we've talked a little bit about the range of public-private partnerships and the need to kind of expand that definition of public-private partnerships. From Citi's perspective, why do you engage in PPPs to begin with? How is that mutually beneficial?
Well, I think we start from the point of view of saying, where's a problem where we can add value and where, frankly, and I should distinguish between my two hats. Anything we do in the City Foundation benefits the public at large. But I also wear another hat, which is working with our businesses around the world and in different areas to achieve objectives that do two things. I always describe it as the great sweet spot, which is things that are good for our business, but they're also good for humanity or the planet. And it turns out there are a lot of those. Mm-hmm. And those are ways that we can do to both improve our business and improve the reputation of the company and our value add and to our employees and our clients. So that's the background. And when we think about these public-private partnerships, I think we explore different areas. And let me give you one example. We signed a memorandum of understanding around the issue of infrastructure I'm losing my thought here, with C40, which is now meeting in South Africa. And the memorandum of understanding is not around a specific project. It's around this whole issue of intellectual exchange of ideas and understanding what the possibilities are. There may be things that come out of this, which is obviously our bankers are very interested in this because they're interested in developing specific opportunities to finance. But it's also an exchange of ideas, and we're focusing particularly starting on energy efficiency finance, but we're also looking at infrastructure finance. Alonso mentioned water. That's obviously a key issue. Distributed energy is another one. And we started out this conversation building on conversations we had had with the Better Buildings Initiative and the Clinton Global Initiative. That morphed into conversations with C40, which morphed into this idea of working with their infrastructure network. They organize with different networks within C40. We started out by having a conversation generally. We've gotten much more specific. And now in South Africa, we have created a document that tries to organize around what are the low-hanging fruit, what are the characteristics of building this infrastructure, what is easier to do, what is harder to do, and how can we think about what are the necessary elements to bring that to fruition.
And I think on that point, it's also a question of how do you roll out, how do you start to define the collaboration with a particular city. It seems like the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, well, I should say in this one, the collaboration has been going on for 1.5 years. And right now, it's all in the ideas phase. So we're investing a lot, as Alonso says, in the conversation, right, in the learning. Mm-hmm. What do these cities actually need? What is helpful to them? How can we be helpful, and how can we learn? So this is a long process. This is not for the faint of heart, right. And it isn't let's do a public-private partnership here because it's going to produce X, Y, Z in 6 months.
Right, right. Alonso, can you talk a little bit about some of CH2M experience on that slow evolutionary process and working with cities?
There's a very interesting project. It's called the New Factory Design PP project in Singapore. And it was an innovative partnership that we set up with the Public Utilities Board in Singapore. And they were looking to try to provide a leading-edge water delivery system that improves the supply sufficiency and keeps the cost of water affordable. Every municipality's problem going forward, I think, and around the world. And we were able to put together a group of key people within CH2M that created now what I think is a more vibrant and innovative water hub, greatly enhancing the livability of the city and the PP leaders. And I think it's one of the leading PPP activities in Asia. And I think what's happened in this process is that by having the technical assistance, creating an affordable system within the country, now they've looked at other green ways of producing a city that I think the rest of Asia is starting to look at. And I think we need more of a catalytic approach where countries are taking on these activities and actually implementing them and creating a catalytic approach saying, hey, maybe we might want to try that in Manila or maybe try that in Indonesia.
And Anne-Marie, on that point, what have you found from the public sector standpoint of the best way to reach out and engage with the private sector to be able to have that kind of evolutionary process of working together collaboratively to define the specific agenda within a city?
It is very, very slow. I think the first thing that you need to take into consideration is that it's long-term, so you can't think about, at least from the federal government perspective, we're going to have results in a couple of months. I think that because we need to dedicate some time to the communication and the language and the culture. So you need to go in with that mentality. And then think about what are the way that we're looking at it is, what are the creative financing mechanisms that we can learn from? What are the types of things, Pam talked about the Better Business, the Better Buildings Challenge, like challenges and crowdsourcing and all these other things that businesses do and foundations on a regular basis that we can learn from. We're also working, as you were saying, in the local. As a federal government, we're not used to the place-based work, I think, is very important. So how do we engage within the footprint? So that kind of dance, we're working on the federal government. So we tend to work with we were working when we first launched the office with the national foundations, but so much of the work happens on the local level. So how do we work with the community foundations, the regional foundations, the footprints all across the country? So trying to figure that out for a federal agency that doesn't necessarily have that capacity has been very difficult. What we're trying to do is take this approach and really expand it to other federal agencies across the US so that they understand how to do it. So it's not just one agency, so it's all of the agencies are really going in the same direction, and I think that makes it easier for the foundations and also for the private sector to start figuring us out.
And we're gonna leave, just so everyone knows, we're gonna leave plenty of time for questions. I know that there are many urban experts here with us today, so I'm gonna ask one or two more questions. So start thinking of your questions, and then we'll leave plenty of time before the panel concludes, and there's a coffee break. But I want to just follow up on your point, Anna Marie, about sharing those lessons learned, right? And that's a really, and Alonso, you alluded to that as well, insofar as the work that's being done in Manila, and how do you share that more broadly with other cities? And I want to go back to Pam here.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
I think the bigger problem is that there's not enough belief in the countries and in the leadership within those countries. And by creating a catalytic approach, you get something that is positive. For example, in Indonesia, I was there about 4 months ago, and on Saturdays, they close a 2-mile stretch of the downtown, and people are just walking and riding their bicycles because they have no green space. There's an issue of how do we now create a city that people are able to walk around and manage and use in an effective way. And I think the other point that I want to make is that when you look at public-private partnerships, you're looking at advisory services, you're including legal advice, financial modeling. You're trying to add value to that current system. If they had the ability to do it themselves, we wouldn't be a part of that partnership. Yeah. And I think that's what governments are really struggling with. How do we really add value with the growth levels that we have in these countries and these slums that are in our communities? How do we integrate them into the overall process? And I think that's one of the big battles that we're having now, and trying to get the donors, the philanthropic organizations, and the private sector to really understand how we all come together and create a synergistic force on how we're going to deal with these problems of creating new smart cities.
Yeah, Anne-Marie.
I just wanted to add, Alonso inspired for me, the definition of public-private partnerships, I think we struggle with. Maybe in this country we know a little bit more, but I'm not so sure. When I go to other countries, it's really clear. For example, they think of public-private partnerships as we are the government, whether it be state, national, or local, and the public-private partnership is we put out a contract and a private sector company bids on it, they get the contract, and that's our public-private partnership. I think that it's a little dirtier and messier when done best, because it's not just the way that public-private partnerships are often actually taking place. It's really just a transaction. It's really not a partnership. So that needs to be unpacked, not just here, but in many other places, as how that really works. Yeah. And that's where I think is most powerful.
And I think we're talking a little bit about that, is that value-added know-how that the private sector brings to the public sector. It goes much beyond the mobilization of additional resources. It's also kind of the improved efficiency that with public investments by working with the private sector. And it's also, I think, this consumer oriented management style that the private sector has, and all those kind of things kind of come together to make PPPs more beneficial than Anne-Marie, as you're saying, than more of a transactional basis. Pam, you've been working a lot on energy efficiency projects. You spoke a little bit about that, and that seems to be one of those areas as well, where rather than city coming in saying this is our plan, or the city or a government saying this is what we want to do, is city and a particular municipality works together to define and be a part of that entire process from the get-go.
Well, actually, our journey on trying to figure out energy efficiency started about 2 years ago. And we had a meeting of internal people, some external people, some nonprofit organizations, et cetera, to talk about how does energy efficiency get financed. And I would say that the first conversation was quite wandering in terms of, it was very definitely exploratory, and we definitely had some foundations, philanthropic interest in this area as well. We now are about to schedule our fourth convening in this April. Our partner in all of these has been the Environmental Defense Fund. You mightn't think we're two odd fellows to be working on this. And we have advanced tremendously. And the reason it goes back to my comment earlier about the sweet spot of trying to find things that are ways that can have a broad beneficial impact, but are also ways that we can develop our business and we can deploy capital. So we have just completed, or about to complete, we have not completed. This is 2 years later. We have been working on several interesting transactions to bridge the barrier of why this is so difficult to do in the United States. We have lots of little small projects. People put new boilers in, they do windows, they do all the things that reduce their energy bill, and they put renewable energy, which challenges the grid, and it does a whole set of things, but they're difficult to finance. Why are they difficult to finance? Because they're small transactions. When you aggregate them, you want to use the capital markets. The capital markets don't really care whether or not they save energy. They care whether the people, the underlying loans, will repay. That's what they care about. And guess what you need? You need a transaction history over multiple years. You can't do this any faster. You can't create 7 to 10 years of data in 6 months if you work hard at it. So it turns out to be, and there are lots of other issues involved in this of aggregating. You have local governments, you have national governments, you have, they're just a host of, there are contractors, there are legal issues, it turns out it's hard. And so we are about to close a transaction called WHEEL, which is a warehouse for energy efficiency loans, which started in Pennsylvania and it's now into Kentucky. It involves local energy programs in these two states. It involved the Department of Energy allowing the Recovery Act funds to be used initially in the project. It involves a city as a capital market participant. It involves loan originators in local localities. It involves the Renewable Program Energy Administrator. It involves NGOs, the Energy Programs Consortium, and the National Association of State Energy Officials. The number of people involved to bring this to fruition is quite amazing, and not for the faint of heart. But there are tremendous benefits to getting a financing structure that is not a one-off, but that can really aggregate large numbers of these transactions. And I think that by sticking with it over this period of 2 years, we are finally beginning to reach the Holy Grail.
It seems like that's a perfect example of hitting that sweet spot between a project that really benefits the greater public and benefits good for humanity, but at the same time, it also makes business sense as well.
We think we're creating a new market.
Yeah. One last question for Alonso and Emery before opening it up to everybody else here. But Alonso, you've spoken a little bit about some of the, whether it's the work in Indonesia or the Philippines or whatnot. I'd like to get your thoughts on how local PPCs especially, how those can be scaled up and some of those best practice lessons learned. I know it's a difficult question, but
I mean, if we figure that one out, we're probably going to get the Economic Peace Prize. I mean, really, I mean, that's the biggest nightmare, I think, scenario going forward, and how we manage, especially these emerging market countries. I think everybody, the City Foundation, Gates, and others are all doing these one-offs, which are wonderful activities, great projects. But when you start looking at the numbers, they're overwhelming. And if we don't figure out a way to really try to scale these up in a much more effective way, meaning much more leveraging, more private sector involvement, and really bringing the private sector from a problem-solving perspective to the equation, I think that's the piece that's missing. I think I'm watching the Philippines now struggle with this reconstruction effort. They're paralyzed, because this is something, nothing's happened at this level ever in that country. The devastation that happened in Tacloban, they're still trying to figure out how they're going to reconstruct, and everybody's saying build it back resiliently. If you have a government that doesn't understand what resiliency really is, you don't have people understand how to implement it, how to manage that process, it's not going to be very effective. And I think that this is where the foundations and the philanthropic and the donors have really got to come together and start talking about how they're going to work with government to scale up these activities to really deal with these numbers that are growing by the day. I think the 180,000 a day is, I think it's much greater than that. Yeah. Because of the cell phone, everybody wants to be in a secondary city. Everybody wants to be where the jobs are, where the water is, and where they can find activity. And I think the donors are in this struggle of trying to figure out what's better, urban or rural. Well, the rural game is over, last I checked, over the last 5 years. And we've got to figure out a way to encourage them to say, this is an activity that if we don't get ahead of this, we're going to stifle all this economic growth that we put billions and billions of dollars into these countries. And
that is a fundamental challenge, right, Alonso? Is the fact that donor funds still look disproportionately at rural funding versus urban funding. There hasn't been that catch-up.
It's disproportionate, but I think it's a policy issue, and I think the Atlantic Council has been making the policy argument. But I also think it's a sea change for the World Bank and others to really start to focus on the urban areas. And I think the private sector, and you look at GE, the work they're doing on energy. You brought up energy earlier. I think they got it right. I think they recognize power for Africa with the growth rates there. If they don't get power there, that's going to implode on them. How do we do that? You move your best people to West Africa, and you start to put the processes in place. You start to identify the key partners, as I mentioned. You invest in the partnership capabilities, and you follow through. Yeah. And at the end of the day, you follow that process. That allows for you to really know what's going on the ground and make sure that you have the best project possible. Nothing's foolproof other than paying taxes and dying. So in essence, that's the only promise you have. So, and I think the key here is that we have to continue to understand that partnerships are evolving. As Pam said, it's not for the faint-hearted, but I think that the countries can't get to where they want to go without heavy private sector involvement because of the technical needs and the complexity of the problem, and they're integrated. You just can't stovepipe anymore. Yeah, it's got to be an integrated approach, and that's what I believe the private sector's role is, to help manage and provide that innovation to government so that they provide these sustainable projects in a way forward.
Anna Marie, scaling up public-private partnerships. You work very, very broadly on this. What have you seen insofar as maybe even at a smaller level, some ways in which successful partnerships have been able to be scaled up, or what are some of your thoughts on how it's possible?
I think so far we've been working with the army of the willing, right? So it's been opportunistic as to who comes to us, and so because they have an agenda that is similar to us, and so it makes sense. How we scale in a strategic way so that we can reach the proportions that Alonso is talking about, which is much bigger than what we're able to do right now, is the question and the puzzle for us at this point, not just in the U.S., but I think broadly. We don't really have vehicles that are helping us come together, like the rural and the urban, vehicles that help us think about these in an interdependent way, which they are. So that's, I think, what we're struggling with to figure out how to do that. The World Urban Forum, which we're all here to talk about, I think is one vehicle because it brings us across these, what really are fake delineations, and it helps us to stop that that stovetyping that we're just so used to doing. But having a vehicle that would be national or international that allows us, I think, is the next challenge.
Yeah.
Can I just make one
Sure,
comment
please.
on an example of scale in a very different way? We've been, wearing my city foundation hat, very interested in the issue of financial capability. Not financial education, but financial capability, meaning it's not about educating people, it's about giving them a tool so they actually can save more money or pay down debt or be better off. And so we supported these financial empowerment centers in New York City that had actual counselors that dealt with people on their financial issues. And they were so successful since in about the last 3 years, they've had counseling sessions with 26,000 people who have reduced debt by $14.7 million and created $2.5 million worth of savings. It was so successful that it was then incorporated into the New York City budget, and it's now part of a public provision. This will allow it to reach a scale which it could never reach by being a philanthropic project. So I think that's a good example of innovation that works and can achieve scale.
That's great, thank you. I'd like to open up to questions. Please raise your name when the microphone comes to you. If you give your name and affiliation before asking your question, that'd be great. Right back there.
Hi, I'm Rick Rybeck with Just Economics, and I appreciate the panel and all the good information they're providing. Question is, often successful efforts to improve neighborhoods or cities result in enriching the landowners there at the expense of the residential and business tenants who are the intended beneficiaries, leading to a case of no good deed goes unpunished. And I'm wondering what insights you have about how to overcome that conundrum.
Well, I would say that wearing my philanthropic hat, one of the things that we have been working in a collaborative in New York City is the post-Sandy learnings. And as you may know, many of the communities that were most heavily impacted on the coastal areas were our middle to lower income communities, as often happens in these disasters. And we've been working on a collaborative of foundation with the Mayor's Fund to think about how can we strengthen the ability of these lower income communities and moderate income communities to recover from this. And specifically the issue of civic strength. There was a really interesting study done on a heat wave in Chicago a few years ago. I can't remember who actually did it, but it compared two different communities, very similar from every demographic characteristic, very low income. One in which no one died, and the other one in which a number of people died and they had terrible things happen. And when they looked back to understand those, a lot of it had to do with the social infrastructure and the health of the community. So one of the things we're working on as a collaborative is what tools do we need to give these communities? For example, community centers, settlement houses. What tools do they need to be able to contact elderly people who live in high-rise buildings, et cetera? But we're talking about helping to build the civic infrastructure that helps communities to be healthy. That doesn't directly address your issue of landowners, but it certainly addresses, I think, the issue of how do you make these communities more resilient.
Alonzo, do you want to take a stab at that as well on the infrastructure?
That's out of my bandwidth.
Okay. Yes, next question. Yes.
Yes.
If you could wait for the microphone, please.
My name is Jim Whitaker. I'm with the Smart Cities Council. We're a group of 25 plus leading technology companies and so on involved in trying to accelerate and inform cities to become smarter. In any case, my question goes primarily to Ms. Flaherty. What in your empowerment, financial empowerment program, was the exit strategy to get the city to pick it up? And secondly, in this very difficult coalition, public-private partnership, which probably involves 25 different organizations and contracts and different objectives. Is there a built-in exit plan? Are you looking to be able to evolve that where it gets up and running and then it runs on its own without all of the organizations involved for 10 years?
No, I would say that that was not our objective, to have it financed by the city initially. I think, generally speaking, from a philanthropic point of view, we always approach things from the point of view that if you really want to scale it, it probably has to be taken up either in some public policy way or by some level of government that will allow finance, or it has to develop a market that will happen by itself. So I don't think we envisaged that, and certainly not with the speed that it happened. But it's turned out to have many legs beyond just the Financial Empowerment Center. It's now evolved in further to think about how do you reach people, not in just these financial empowerment centers, but where people are. So you put that capacity in social service organizations, for example, in public housing, or in other ways that you can reach people. So I think it's had a number of iterations and possibilities that we did not foresee. I'd like to say we were so smart, but we were not.
A lot of questions here. I'm going to take, there's the fifth row here, 2 questions. Actually, why don't we take them both together, actually. Wait for the microphone. Victor, right here.
My name is Neil Pierce with the Cityscope Project. For the World Urban Forum 2 years ago, I was asked to do, with my colleague Farley Peters, a study. And we watched the Nearing Naples process here, preparing for the World Urban Forum 2 years ago in Naples. And then we went to monitored the sessions and watched what the strengths and weaknesses were as we saw it at the World Urban Forum. And I'm fascinated by the business focus this morning because we found a huge weakness. The World Urban Forum sessions had some business representation, but very minor and not a major part of the consideration or the debates at that point. So we thought that was really a major omissions. Multiple other topics, many social and other economic issues, but not in terms of a business involvement. So my question would be, to the panel this morning, is there a natural way for business in the United States, let's say especially, to take more active involvement, to take a more active role with the World Urban Forum, engaging these thousands of people who come to these sessions to bring out more effectively business opportunities, engagements, and the role of international business in city building?
Excellent question, Neil. Let me take the question next to you as well, and we'll answer them together.
Don Borat, former director of the National League of Cities. Innovation involves risk. Mm-hmm. When you take a risk, some things don't work. Mm-hmm. And my question has to do with, in these public-private initiatives and philanthropic initiatives, what are ways that the private sector and the philanthropic sector can in fact protect the public officials who are going out on a limb, who they're always going to have folks who are trying to shoot at them and show that they're not competent. How do you protect them and learn from those experiences to avoid folks not wanting to take the risks in the first place?
Yeah. Thank you, Don. Great question.
Let me tackle the second one first. I think that's a great question, and I think it goes back to the point we made earlier about the need to have the strategic conversation up front. You have to have a partner that understands the risk, but also a private sector entity that has relationships within the country at the highest levels. So you're socializing that potential risk so that everybody's got skin in the game. If you go in a room and you devise a program, a water project, that is going to cost 10% more and you have to raise the rates, and you don't socialize that, what does that lead to? That guy getting thrown out of office, or better yet, he could have threats made against him. So I think it's back to managing the local level activities at the local level with the partner, having an upfront conversation about the risk, and then socializing those risks with your partners. And I think the project that I didn't aptly point out in Singapore. I mean, they wanted to have a much more effective way of delivering services without raising those costs. Some of those costs did go up, but the fact that they socialized it at the right levels, at the senior levels of government, everybody understood the risk. Now, if it had gone up 20%, that might have been a bigger problem. But it's really not rocket science. It's really having an effective partner, knowing your partner, and understanding the political risk and the economic risks in the country, and then managing it in an effective way.
Anne-Marie.
If I can add to that, I think that's why you heard, especially at the beginning of this administration, we were talking so much about the what works and things that were evidence-based, because I think the federal government wanted to see what was working in with foundations, what foundations were investing in, and what the private sector was investing in. So if it started in another sector and we can take a look and we can point to it working, it's easier for us in the federal government to take it up and scale it. A really great tool is also, if you take a look at the Corporation for National Service has the Social Impact Fund, the SIF. And that's been a way for us to take innovations that have been started in other sectors or that are smaller in the federal government with other intermediaries and partners and really scale it up. So I think we require conversations, and somebody testing it, piloting it, demonstrating it is really helpful.
And one of the things that I think has happened during this period is a tremendous emphasis on metrics and on data. Big data opens up big possibilities, but there's also much more conversation around exactly what works and what doesn't work. I think that helps when you're thinking about how do you scale up something. You don't do it because it has a good purpose. You do it because it has demonstrated impact. Yeah. And I was just looking at the website of the Department of Transportation in New York City. There's a company called Streetline that city invested in, and what it does is put little markers in on streets to tell where parking spaces are available. It turns out that a large part of greenhouse gas emissions in cities is created by cars who are wandering around looking for parking spots. And so this is a technology that allows, so you can, but it's being tested first. So you go to this neighborhood in the Bronx and you click on it and it'll show on Arthur Avenue and 187th Street where the, if it's brown, that means there are not many parking spaces here, but the green over here means there are parking spaces. So you test it first, you find out how to implement it. You don't just go for the big solution, and you have set it up in advance. So you've got the metrics, the feedback from people. You understand it small before you take it big. Mm-hmm.
That's an excellent project. Can I also get back to Neil's question about, and I was going to direct that to you, Anne-Marie, about how more U.S. business can get engaged with the
And I'm glad Neil brought that up, because that's actually something that I would flip back to the audience and to the panelists. We've struggled in the past to get U.S. involvement. What Neil said is not actually exactly accurate. The World Urban Forum has a lot of business involvement, but it's European businesses. Yeah. It's not U.S. businesses. So what we need to do is increase the presence of U.S. businesses. In the past, we've worked with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the BCLC, the Business Civic Leadership Center. That's not enough. I think we need to broaden the interest of U.S.-based corporations and businesses. We at HUD don't know how to do that, and so we will be interested to understand, given that there's still, about 67 days to opening ceremonies, an opportunity to really have a fuller delegation that would include private sector.
And I think that's probably one of the reasons that you're hosting these series, this being the launch event, but a series of discussions across the United States leading up to the WOOF to get multiple actors engaged.
Yes.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, Nicholas.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Yu. I'll be speaking in the second session.
Oh, we'll learn from you.
Mine is rather a comment. I think I was engaged in the last 3 years with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in helping about 11 cities around the world where we would have a partnership of private sector companies representing different sectors to help one particular city to try to solve its problems. One of the lessons we learned, I think, is that you need first the public-public partnership to work before the public-private partnership actually has a chance to survive. I think Alonso alluded to it. You need the institutional framework. You need a legal framework, and the legal framework is especially important if you want to go to scale. Let me just give one example. When I worked with Habitat for over 20 years, our biggest struggle, because we were located in Nairobi, was how do we deal with Kibera, Africa's largest contiguous slum, which is right in the center of Nairobi. And one of the biggest problems is how do we get water into that slum, right? And then how do we get the used water out of the slum? It took a very young legal advisor to break the mold. For 20 years, we struggled with this problem. And it was a young legal advisor who said, we've been struggling because you've been struggling with public legal rights. Why don't you use commercial law? Willing buyer, willing seller. It's part of the legal system. So the minute we started breaking the mold of our thinking and saying, can we find a willing supplier and a willing buyer? So we organized the community into an NGO that had a juridical personality, could open a bank account, because nobody in Kibera can open a bank account. They don't have an address, right? Once they had the bank account, they could sign a contract with a willing supplier. And there we escaped the legal framework that most public utilities work with. But it took a young, brilliant person to say, hey, let's look at this from a completely different way. Now that still hasn't scaled up because now there's opposition against using commercial law everywhere else in Kenya. So it's a legal battle that still has to be won. The day we win it, the going to scale will, I am convinced, will happen overnight.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Can I take a question as well, and then we can address the question and Nicholas's comment at the same time, because we have so many questions. Yes, Kent.
Hi, great panel. Thanks, Jason, and everybody. Kent Watkins, chairman of National Academy of Housing and Sustainable Communities. One of the things that with Neil and the National League of Cities reminded me of the discussion of models for innovation, and particularly it made me think of some things that we did some years ago, but which are missing now, and I might call your attention to this particular model. And it was dealing with hardware and software innovations, and we had League of Cities, Conference of Mayors, ICMA, and NACO as a consortium with HUD, PD&R. Mike Moscow then was the assistant secretary, and provided some grants as well as the German Marshall Fund. And through that, we set up a group called Public Technology, Inc., which you all remember. And that was the research arm of the consortium. And through that came such things as working with General Motors on common specifications for fire trucks so that everybody didn't have all their customized models. And that helped on the procurement side. The meter maid, as it was called, thing for parking tickets, handheld computers, came out of that. But more importantly, what we began to do then was link it to the same kind of role with the German cities, with a technology group called DOTM, who serviced them. In the UK, with their technology group for the...
Can we get to your question? Yeah.
Algarou, and in France with the public-private partnership. So my, I guess, search for comment is, I've heard some of the models that you talked about and some of the others, but is there still something missing in this space, as you call it, where we can resuscitate these consortia of cities around the world and countries that have that have R&D groups working for them, like the one I mentioned?
Thank you. Great question. Yeah, Anne Marie.
I wanted to address Nick, and I think it's important to talk about the global landscape and that there are two distinct polar opposite frameworks and possibly some in between. And we need to take, if you only work here in the US, you don't realize, for example, if you go to Brazil, Thailand, and other places, they have the French approach. So they actually cannot engage in a PPP until they're given permission by the legislation. You know, it has to, you have to ask permission first before you can do that. Here in the US and the countries that follow the Anglo approach, we actually do the PPPs until there's like a boundary put on us. So one is you can overtly engage, and in the other one, you can't even start until you're given permission. And so you have to recognize that there are these constraints in the perspectives and in the what is allowed to engage in before you start the work. And it's going to, one company that works in all of these is going to be having to fine-tune their approach in each different country.
Right. Just to add a quick, I really appreciate your comment on Kenya because that's been a long-going issue on the regulatory environment there. But it goes to the point of what we've been trying to describe here, why partnerships are so difficult, PPPs are so difficult, but needed. And if you don't have trust, you've got to have equity, you've got to have competence, which we talked a little bit about at the local level, inclusivity, because if you don't get everyone involved, they'll end up sabotaging the deal. And then you've got to have the right partnership alliance within those countries. And then the most important, providing those services, what's the mutual benefit? What are we going to get from this? And I think that's what those communities are looking for. And then most of the private companies who involve themselves in these partnerships, especially a very conservative firm like mine, they're looking for transparency. And if you don't have all of those things in place, it makes an executive who's worried about his or her reputation of the company, it makes them very skittish. But that being said, back to the point someone was making, why aren't more companies engaged? I just think we haven't made it a mutual benefit like the Europeans have. And like most of the Asian countries, they are engaging in these areas because it's affecting their cities. And I think part of the problem is it's not affecting us as much here at home, and there's not enough of a business interest yet, or as you say, the model, the economic model is not one that really forces them to the table.
Pam, do you want to address Ken's comment about research and development and how to share some of those practices?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that because I don't really understand the background of that. I will say that I think there's an explosion of interest in cities on the part of businesses, and there's an excitement around, and it may come from our environment where it seems that things are difficult to get done at the national level, but I think it also is just an excitement about what cities can do.
That's domestic, right, Pam?
Huh?
You're talking about domestic, though.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But I know what the real catalytic event is when businesses decide it's part of their business strategy.
Yeah.
And if you listen to the CEO of Citi now, Mike Corbat will say that our strategy, we used to describe ourselves as we're in over 100 countries around the world. He now says we're in 150 cities around the world and describes our target audience as cities. And internally, it's called City for Cities. And so there's an increasing interest in understanding how our capacity and capabilities translates into cities. And the reality is, as a global company, we are in urban areas around. We generally have a relatively small footprint in terms of our physical presence, but we have great capacity and capabilities, and that translates into a sense of business excitement about engaging with cities, and that has prompted a whole set of interesting gatherings of people internally who want to figure out what are the business opportunities, and that's when you get real action.
Yeah, excellent point. A question in the second row right here.
Jeannie Birch from the University of Pennsylvania. It seems to me, in listening to you, there's a capacity issue and there's a training issue. Being an academician, I'm wondering about the next generation of leaders. What is it that we need to be teaching them? Can you help us with that?
Good broad question.
How many young people in the room? Let me see. Okay. No, I after leaving AID, we had one of the largest training processes come and play the last 3 years of the previous administration, last 2 years of the previous administration. And I think there is the enthusiasm of the young people and the smartness of them is second to none. I think that we really have to provide them with safe learning environments. No matter how smart they are and how well they retain information and what university they go to, at the end of the day, they got to spend time working on the mundane things that help you understand how the dots really do connect. And I think the internships, spending time abroad, working on projects, not just in NGOs, but working in public-private partnership activities overseas, I think those are the kinds of things that we really have to encourage them to do, because when you look at our competitors, you see most of their young people, spending 3, 4, 5 years in a job, not being the president after 3 years. And I think that's one of the things that we really got to bridle some of that enthusiasm and some of that interest and really get them in environments. For example, my first year in aid, first couple of years, I managed $1 million. If you tell one of these young people they coming out of school they're going to manage $1 million, they'd say, I'm not going to work here. This is beneath me. I've had some of the people we recruited say, I need to be managing bigger and better things. And I don't mean to put them on the spot, but I think those are some of the things that we've got to do is manage expectations.
$1 million that's a lot of money to think that's below that. I don't know who you were talking to. Well, I wanted to, let's take one last question and then we'll close the panel so we can get to our coffee break. Yeah.
Hi, I'm from the U.S. Department of Labor, Bureau of International Labor Affairs.
What's your name?
My name is Katie Cook.
Thanks, Katie.
And I'm just wondering if you have any interesting examples of projects, public-private partnerships that have reduced unemployment or reduced economic vulnerability.
Great.
Well, I would say that the whole green economy, they go back to the wheel transaction I was talking about and energy efficiency. Guess who does all that work in contractors? It is by definition local. It's not going to Mumbai. These are people who put in windows. They are people who put in boilers. They are people who work in houses. They are, for the most part, local contractors. So enabling energy efficiency to be financed at scale and to expand will reduce the household bills of those households, but it also creates employment. And I think that's one of the things that we want to track and understand.
Mm-hmm. Anne-Marie?
I would point to what we call the Sustainable Communities Initiative, which is a partnership between the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation, and EPA here in the US. It has a couple of years under its belt now, so we have some case studies and some examples of jurisdictions across the country that came together to do what we call integrated planning, connecting the land use with the employers, with the transportation, with the housing. It sounds simple, but this integrated approach to planning across ministries, across cabinet agencies, is really, really hard work. We're looking to Brazil because they're trying to do it as well through their Ministry of Housing. But I think that unless you're not going to improve the employment opportunity unless the housing and the transportation and all those access points are connected. And so look at the grantees. We have the first cohort just graduated, and they're doing great things.
Great. Thank you. Well, I wanted to take this opportunity to again thank our panelists for, I think, an excellent conversation to provide a real nuanced perspective on the range of PPPs, how do you engage in PPPs, how they can be beneficial for cities, and how, I think also importantly, and Pam, you mentioned this as well, but getting this into the business plan of corporations. And that's really what showing that importance of partnerships for the business bottom line is really what drives some of that ability to engage with cities. So I want to thank again our panel, also point you to the 3-pager by the Adrienne Arsht Center on some of our thoughts on policy formulation, some of the experiences from Latin America. So thank you, Pam. Thanks, Alonzo. Thank you, Anna Marie.